Okay, welcome again to Vitenskap och Demokrati, Science and Democracy. The last 2 weeks, we talked first about the question whether the state, the authority, the power the state has over an individual can be justified at all and how it might be justified. We looked at the social contract tradition to try to justify it through the consent that people give to the state. Several of you were defenders of anarchism, how that state authority cannot be justified. And last week we looked at how the conflict can occur between what's good for an individual and what is in the common good, what's good for everyone. We looked at that through the lens of game theory, in particular, the prisoner's dilemma. And the tragedy of the commons illustrates that in powerful ways. We looked at very many areas where these kinds of conflict between what is in the interest of an individual and what is in the common interest can occur. So we'll continue on the same path today, but today we'll look at the question of how far the state's power should go, where the limits of the state's authority should be. Okay. So I'm going to start with some examples to get us thinking about liberty, that is individual liberty, that the individual has the power to decide over their own life, in the limits of that the state might put onto this. Okay, so we can divide this roughly into the following two arenas. On the one hand, the question of how much should the state be allowed to limit what I as an individual can do concerns question about how much freedom of actions should I have? What should I be allowed to do with my life? Okay. And the second, and in this area, we have, for example, controversial cases. Like, is it okay for an individual to run a brothel, to run the brothel, to work as a prostitute, to go to the brothel, to pay for sex? Should these be the kind of things that are allowed? This is from Germany, where there's a lot more freedom for that than, for example, in Norway. Okay. Another controversial area is drugs. Should there be limits to the drugs that an individual can consume, ranging from marijuana to cocaine, heroin, various kinds of pills, speed, and so on and so forth. Okay. Should there be limits to that, or should the individual be allowed to use whatever drugs they wanted to use? Another question is, for example, the power of individuals to use whatever they find on the internet for their own creative licenses. So in mashup music, this is a project here in the University of Oslo that studies mashup music. You, for example, mix together, I don't know, here's one of my favorite ones, they mix together the AC/DC and some funk song, okay? So in a kind of cool way, but of course, often these are copyright protected, these songs. So should artists be allowed to make free use of this, or should these rights of the previous artists who create these songs be somehow, so they restrict my liberty to use them in new artwork? Okay, it's not there. So now we've talked about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So these are areas where the question of the state authority can arise. And of course, this question of how much a state might interfere with individual liberty has been something that has been very much at the forefront in the last year, where there have been more severe restrictions on individual liberty than really ever before in Norway and in Germany and in other countries, where people have been ordered to not leave the house, where public institutions like the university have been state-ordered to close their premises. Gatherings have been extremely limited. People have been limited how many friends they can see. People have been forced to wear particular kinds of clothing, like a face mask, in particular places. And in some countries, people are tracked through apps. In Norway, that's not obligatory, but in some countries, like Hong Kong, there, like people's movements are tracked through these apps, and so the state keeps an eye on where you are each time. So the liberty, the freedom to do whatever you want, has been extremely limited. Question: is the state within the state's right to do that? Okay, so this is to the question of how much freedom of the action should you have, and when and where is a state should a state be allowed to limit your individual freedom? Another area is freedom of expression. How much freedom of expression should you have? What should you be allowed to say in which kinds of circumstances? And again, there are extremely controversial cases. So Anders Breivik, for example, here expressing his adherence to fascist Nazi ideology in court, should he be allowed to express his racist views in the public like that? Again, states have made different decisions. In Norway, this is not illegal. In Germany, for example, this would be illegal, and he could be punished more for that. Another case we just saw this year, a few weeks ago, should Trump have the freedom to say whatever he says, even if that causes, say, these riots in the storming of the Capitol, the coup attempt by these rioters? Or should a president's or anyone's freedom of speech be limited by the fact that it might cause such riots? Other question which has come up, we find spreading of conspiracy theories. Question: should there be limits to what people should be allowed to voice in about this? Should there be limits to what, for example, can voice about this on Facebook, in demonstrations? Should then, on the other hand, should Facebook have the power to limit the freedom of expression, or should this be a state's authority? Okay, again, questions about limitations of state authority are very powerful here. And of course, you might think that this fundamental right to freedom of expression, if it is, for example, limited through these COVID restrictions, that this can be problematic, because the freedom of expression is such, and freedom for public gathering also is such a fundamental right that the state should not be allowed to interfere with that, many people think. Okay, so this shows us this issue of what should the limits of individual liberty be arises in so many areas of contemporary discussion. And another last one is just that this discussion that we find about canceling, also here in Norway, when certain academics, for example, like Steven Pinker, when they are uninvited from events because they, according to the organizer, have expressed sexist views, they complain that their freedom of expression has been violated. They should be free to express those opinions. Okay. So again, is this something that the state should interfere in at this point, or is this freedom of expression something that people should have? Again, another area. Okay, so this issue of the limits of liberty, individual liberty, arises everywhere in our contemporary society. And at this point, I'd like to invite each of you to make a list of the actions that you think a state should be allowed to forbid, and a list of those actions the state should not be allowed to forbid. Ask yourself, when you make that list, does it make a difference whether the state is one that is democratically elected? So do you think it makes a difference to what the state is allowed to do, how it's allowed to limit the liberties of its citizens, that those citizens may have themselves elected the government in that state? Do you think that makes a difference, or do you think that doesn't make a difference? And also make a list of the speech acts, the things that people can say, the views they can express, and the conditions under which they express them that you think the state should be allowed to forbid, and a list of those speech acts that the state should not be allowed to forbid. So is there anything that people should not be allowed to say, or not maybe allowed to say in certain conditions in some places? For example, certain things that people should not be allowed to say in schools, in a court, at a rally, at the university, in as a member of government, and so on. So are there things that the state should forbid people to say? And what explains what is on which side of your list? So that if you have a principle that explains that, then you would have an account of the power that the state should have or should not have to restrict individual liberty. Okay, at this point, I invite you to sit down and do that. And in the next part of the lecture, we'll learn about how Stuart Mill addresses that issue.